My name is Francine, and at 34 years old, I thought I knew everything about my family until the day of my mother's will reading. Mum had passed away 3 months earlier from cancer, leaving behind a $20 million fortune. My sister Katherine had always been her golden child, the one who could do no wrong. But what happened in that lawyer's office changed everything we thought we knew about our family. Before I share what happened that day, when $15 million became worthless in seconds, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear how a mother's final letter revealed secrets that destroyed everything. Growing up, I always knew where I stood in our family hierarchy. I was Francine, the middle school teacher, who married Tom, a construction worker. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in suburban Philadelphia with our 2 kids, Emma, who's 8, and Jake, who's 6. Every morning I drove my 10-year-old Honda to school, packed lunches in reused containers and clipped coupons for grocery shopping. We were happy with our simple life, finding joy in backyard barbecues and family movie nights. Katherine lived in a completely different world. At 36, she was an investment banker in Manhattan, working for one of those firms where bonuses came with 6 zeros. She never married, always saying her career was her true love. Her apartment overlooked Central Park, filled with furniture that cost more than my annual salary. She wore Chanel suits to Sunday brunch and carried handbags that could pay for Emma's entire college education. When she visited, which wasn't often, she'd arrive in her white Tesla complaining about having to leave the city. Our mother Dorothy was the source of all this wealth. She'd built a pharmaceutical company from absolutely nothing, starting in our garage when we were babies. Dad had died in a car accident when Katherine was 15 and I was 13, leaving Mum to raise us alone while building her empire. She sold the company 5 years ago for $20 million, finally able to rest after decades of 18-hour days. But even in retirement, she remained the formidable woman who could silence a boardroom with a single glance. The favoritism started early in our childhood. Katherine got private tutors in French and Mandarin while I went to public school. When I struggled with math, Mum told me to work harder. When Katherine struggled with science, Mum hired a PhD student from Princeton to help her. I remember being 11 years old, winning first place in a storytelling competition. Mum couldn't make it because Katherine had a piano recital the same day. She chose the child who was playing Chopin over the one reading her own creative writing. The pattern continued through high school. Katherine's acceptance to Harvard was celebrated with a trip to Europe. My acceptance to State University was acknowledged with a nod and a comment about keeping student loans low. When I graduated with honours and got my teaching certificate, Mum said teaching was a noble profession for those who couldn't do more. When Katherine got her first job on Wall Street, Mum threw a party for 50 people at the country club. The Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago perfectly captured our family dynamic. I'd spent 2 days cooking, making everything from scratch, including Mum's favourite cornbread stuffing. Katherine flew in that morning, bringing a store-bought pie from some expensive bakery. As we sat around the table, Mum spent the entire meal asking Katherine about her latest deals, her promotion prospects, her investment strategies. When Tom tried to share news about his construction company landing a major contract, Mum barely looked up from her plate. When I mentioned that I'd been nominated for Teacher of the Year, she said that was nice, and immediately asked Katherine about her bonus structure. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found Mum in the kitchen. I asked her point blank why Katherine's achievements always seemed to matter more. She looked at me with this expression I'll never forget, somewhere between pity and frustration. She said Katherine understood success in a way I never would, that some people were meant to change the world, while others were meant to teach children their ABCs. I went to bed that night feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. When Mum got diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, everything shifted, at least practically speaking. Katherine was too busy with a major merger to come to the first oncology appointment. I was there holding Mum's hand when the doctor explained the treatment options. I drove her to every chemotherapy session, sitting in those uncomfortable hospital chairs for hours while poison dripped into her veins. I cleaned up when she couldn't make it to the bathroom in time. I held her hair back when the nausea became unbearable. Katherine flew in once a month, usually for less than 24 hours. She'd sweep in with expensive flowers and gourmet food Mum couldn't eat, talking about deals and markets while Mum dozed from the morphine. She hired a private nurse, which was helpful, but she never sat in the darkness at 3 a.m. when Mum was scared and couldn't remember where she was. She never sang the old lullabies that helped Mum fall back asleep or rubbed her feet when they swelled from the medication. During one of Mum's lucid moments near the end, she held my hand and said she'd made sure everyone would get what they deserved. I thought she meant she was finally recognizing all those nights I'd spent by her side. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd seen who had really been there when it mattered. She died 2 days later on a Tuesday morning while I was reading her favorite poetry. Katherine was in Tokyo closing a deal. The morning of the will reading arrived 3 months after Mum's funeral. October rain pelted against our bedroom window as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my only black dress for what felt like the 100th time. It was the same one I'd worn to Mum's funeral, a simple thing I'd bought at Target 5 years ago. Tom sat on the bed watching me fumble with borrowed pearl earrings that my neighbour had lent me for the occasion. Tom kissed me goodbye at the door, saying he'd stay home with the kids since we couldn't afford a babysitter for what might be an all-day affair. His rough hands held mine for an extra moment. He knew how much this day meant to me, not because of the money, though paying off our mortgage would lift a weight we'd carried for years, but because it felt like Mum's final judgment on our lives. The drive downtown took 45 minutes through morning traffic. The law firm of Wellington Barnes and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a building that screamed old money. Marble floors, mahogany panels, leather chairs that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt like ascending to some kind of financial heaven where normal people like me didn't belong. Katherine's white Tesla was already in the visitor parking area, of course, taking up 2 spaces to avoid door dings. I parked my Honda 3 rows back, checking twice that I'd locked it properly. The security guard at the front desk looked at me like I might be there to deliver something rather than attend a meeting. When I gave him my name, his eyebrows rose slightly before he handed me a visitor badge. The conference room was exactly what you'd expect from a firm that handled estates for Philadelphia's elite families. A massive oak table dominated the space, surrounded by 12 leather chairs that looked like they belonged in a museum. Original oil paintings of stern-looking founding partners watched from the walls. Katherine was already seated at the far end, scrolling through her phone, with the kind of focus she usually reserved for million-dollar trades. She wore a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. When she looked up and saw me, her expression didn't change. No smile, no nod, just a brief acknowledgement before returning to her screen. The greeting between us was 3 words total. She said Francine and I said Katherine, and that was the extent of our sisterly connection. Other relatives began filing in over the next 15 minutes. Aunt Margaret, Mum's sister, arrived wearing enough jewellery to stock a small store. She'd always been bitter that Mum had succeeded where her own business ventures had failed. Uncle Richard, Dad's brother, looked uncomfortable in his ill-fitting suit. He'd been a mechanic his whole life, more at home under a car than in a law office. 3 cousins I barely recognised rounded out the group, all children of Mum's deceased brother who lived in California. Marcus Wellington entered precisely at 9 o'clock. He was around 60 with silver hair that had been perfectly styled since the day I'd first met him at Dad's funeral 20 years ago. He'd handled our family's legal matters for 3 decades, knew all our secrets, or so we thought. But that morning something was different about him. His usual confident stride seemed hesitant. He kept adjusting his glasses, clearing his throat, shuffling papers that were already perfectly aligned. The stack of documents he placed on the table was thicker than I'd expected. Mum had always been meticulous about details, but this seemed excessive even for her. Wellington's hands trembled slightly as he arranged everything, and I noticed him glance at Katherine several times with an expression I couldn't quite read. When he finally sat down, he took a longer than normal pause before speaking. His opening words were standard legal formalities about the reading of the last will and testament of Dorothy Marie Harrison. He explained that Mom had been of sound mind when she'd updated her will 6 months before her death, that all documents had been properly witnessed and notarized. But then he added something that made everyone sit up straighter. He mentioned unusual circumstances that Mum had specifically instructed him to handle in a particular way. The initial bequests were straightforward enough. Aunt Margaret received Mum's jewellery collection, valued at approximately $200,000. Her face lit up as Wellington detailed the inventory of diamond necklaces, emerald rings, and the particularly valuable sapphire brooch that had belonged to our grandmother. She'd been eyeing that collection for years, dropping hints at every family gathering. Uncle Richard inherited the vacation home in Maine, where our families had spent summers when Dad was alive. It needed work, but the property itself was worth at least $500,000. He nodded quietly, probably already thinking about the repairs he'd make the boats he'd dock at the private pier. It was fitting since he'd helped Dad build the deck and guest house with his own hands. The 3 cousins each received $50,000 for education expenses, whether for themselves or their children. They seemed satisfied, whispering among themselves about graduate school and private kindergarten. Everyone appeared content with their portions, the distribution feeling fair and thoughtful. Mum had remembered everyone considered their needs and situations. Wellington paused, then removing his glasses to clean them, though they looked perfectly clear to me. The pause stretched uncomfortably long. Katherine had put down her phone, sitting forward with poorly concealed anticipation. I found myself holding my breath, mentally calculating what might be left after these bequests. Even if Katherine got more, which seemed inevitable, surely there would be enough to make a real difference in our lives. Wellington's voice cracked slightly as he read the next part. To my daughter, Katherine Marie Harrison, I leave the sum of $15 million to be transferred to her accounts within 30 days of this reading. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 15 million. Katherine's face transformed with a smile of pure triumph. She was already pulling out her phone, presumably texting her financial advisor or perhaps her personal banker. Her fingers flew across the screen as she probably calculated investment returns and tax implications. There was no surprise in her expression, only satisfaction, as if this was exactly what she'd expected all along. My heart didn't just sink, it plummeted through the floor. 15 million to Katherine. I tried to keep my face neutral, but I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. It wasn't about greed, not really. It was about what that number represented. All those nights in the hospital, all those years of being overlooked, they had meant nothing. Even in death, Mum was still choosing Katherine's ambition over my devotion. To my daughter, Francine Louise Bennett, Wellington continued, his voice steadier now. I leave the sum of $500,000 to be transferred to her accounts within 30 days of this reading. 500,000. It was more money than I'd ever seen in my life, enough to pay off our mortgage, set up college funds for the kids, and have some left over for emergencies. Tom would be relieved. We could sleep without worrying about making ends meet. But compared to Katherine's 15 million, it felt like a consolation prize, a pat on the head for the family pet who'd performed their tricks adequately. Katherine looked up from her phone just long enough to speak. Mum always knew I'd use it wisely. She understood that money needs to be actively managed to grow properly. She was already talking about a piece of investment property she'd been eyeing in the Hamptons, something about rental yields and appreciation potential. Not a word about Mum herself, about missing her, about anything beyond the money now flowing her way. She turned to me with an expression that might have been pity if Katherine was capable of such an emotion. 500,000 is still substantial, Francine. You can do a lot with that if you're careful. Maybe Tom can finally fix that truck he's always complaining about. The condescension dripped from every word. She had no idea that Tom had never once complained about his truck, that he took pride in keeping it running with his own hands. I sat there fighting back tears that had nothing to do with the money itself. It was the final confirmation of what I'd always known, but hoped wasn't true. Love could apparently be measured in dollars and cents, and by Mum's calculation, Katherine was worth 30 times more than me. All those bedside vigils, all those gentle moments, when Mum was scared and confused, they added up to exactly $500,000. The other relatives were studiously avoiding eye contact with me, though I could feel their pity radiating across the table. Aunt Margaret clutched her jewelry inventory a little tighter, as if afraid someone might snatch it away. Uncle Richard stared at a point on the wall, probably wishing he was anywhere else. The cousins had stopped whispering, the room falling into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by Katherine's typing. I was about to sign the acceptance papers, to take my $500,000 and leave with whatever dignity remained, when Wellington cleared his throat again. His hands were shaking more noticeably now as he reached for a sealed envelope that had been sitting separately from the other documents. The envelope was cream-coloured expensive stationery that Mum had always used for important correspondence. Written across the front in Mum's distinctive handwriting were the words, "To be read after initial distribution," and below that, smaller but still clearly visible, "The truth sets us free." "There's one more document," Wellington said, his voice barely above a whisper. The colour had drained from his face as he held the envelope. Mrs. Harrison insisted this be read only after the initial bequests were announced. She was very specific about the timing. He broke the wax seal with trembling fingers, pulled out several pages of handwritten text, and began to read in a voice that grew stronger with each word, as if Mum herself was speaking through him. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and it's time for the truth to come out. I've carried these secrets for too long, and they've poisoned everything they touched. Katherine, my darling daughter, who I shaped into something monstrous through my blind favoritism, this is your moment of reckoning. Francine, my overlooked child who succeeded despite my negligence, this is your vindication. The words seemed to echo in the conference room. Everyone leaned forward, confusion written across their faces. Katherine's typing had stopped, her phone frozen in her hand. I felt like I was watching everything from outside my own body, unable to process what was happening. 20 years ago, the letter continued in Wellington's increasingly steady voice. Katherine received her acceptance letter to Harvard. We celebrated, we bragged to everyone who would listen. What I never told anyone, what only Katherine and I knew, was that her acceptance wasn't earned. I paid $2 million to various individuals to ensure her admission. Test scores were altered, recommendation letters were forged. An entire charitable foundation was created on paper to show leadership experience that never existed. Gasps erupted around the table. Katherine's face had gone from confident to ash grey in seconds. That's not... she wouldn't... she stammered, but Wellington continued reading without pause. Katherine knew everything from the beginning. She helped create the fake charity documentation, practiced lies about volunteer work she'd never done. When she struggled in her freshman year, I paid teaching assistants to complete her assignments. When she nearly failed organic chemistry, I donated $5 million to the science department for a new lab. Her degree is built on a foundation of bribes and deception. Aunt Margaret's hand covered her mouth. Uncle Richard was shaking his head slowly, muttering something about always suspecting something wasn't right. The cousins had their phones out, probably recording before Wellington sharply told them to put them away. Her investment banking career followed the same pattern. Mum's letter went on. That prestigious first job I called in, favours from 3 board members. When she made a trading error in her second year that lost the firm $8 million, I quietly covered the loss and paid to have the records altered. When she took credit for the Singapore deal that made her reputation, it was actually structured by a team I hired secretly and fed to her piece by piece. Katherine was standing now, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Stop," she said. But her voice was weak, pleading rather than commanding. 3 more trading errors over the years, each one covered up, each one costing millions to make disappear. An SEC investigation into insider trading that I killed by paying off the lead investigator. A sexual harassment complaint from a junior analyst that I buried with a 7-figure settlement. Every success, every bonus, every promotion was built on lies that I enabled because I couldn't bear to see her fail. The room felt airless. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This wasn't just favoritism. It was systematic fraud spanning decades. Every time Mum had praised Katherine's success while dismissing my achievements, she'd been praising a lie she'd created herself. But the worst secret, Wellington read, his voice dropping lower, is what happened 5 years ago. Katherine was driving home from a client dinner, intoxicated well beyond the legal limit. She struck a college student named Daniel Morrison, who was walking home from his job at a bookstore. She didn't stop, didn't call for help, didn't even slow down. Daniel survived, but is permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Katherine collapsed back into her chair. Her perfect composure, completely shattered mascara, beginning to run down her cheeks. "Mom said it was handled," she whispered, seemingly forgetting we could all hear her. "I paid the Morrison family $10 million for their silence. I destroyed traffic camera footage, bribed 2 witnesses to forget what they saw, and had a contact in the police department lose the incident report." Katherine never showed remorse, never asked about the victim, only worried about her career and reputation. When I told her it was handled, she said good, and never mentioned it again. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the traffic noise from outside seemed to have stopped. I thought about that Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago, how Mum and Katherine had acted so normal while knowing they'd destroyed someone's life just weeks before. "I created this monster," the letter continued. "Through my favoritism, my enabling my willingness to fix every problem with money, I shaped Katherine into someone who believes consequences don't apply to her. Every time I chose her recital over Francine's achievement, every time I dismissed Francine's success as lesser, I was feeding a poison that corroded both my daughters' lives." Wellington paused to drink some water, his hands still shaking slightly. Katherine sat frozen, staring at nothing, her world collapsing around her in real time. Francine succeeded without my help in spite of my neglect. She became a teacher who actually shapes young minds, married a man who works with his hands and comes home to his family every night. She raised 2 children who know the value of honesty and hard work. When I was dying, she was there every single day, not for money, but for love. She held my hand through the worst of it, never knowing the truth about her sister, never understanding why I kept her at arm's length. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't wipe them away. All those years of feeling inadequate, of wondering what I'd done wrong, and it had never been about me at all. The $15 million comes with conditions, Wellington continued reading. Katherine must complete 5 years of twice-weekly therapy with a court-appointed psychologist. She must perform 1,000 hours of community service, specifically with disabled individuals. She must publicly apologize to Daniel Morrison and his family, acknowledging what she did. If she refuses any of these conditions or fails to complete them, the entire $15 million transfers immediately to Francine. Additionally, her current employer must be informed of all the SEC violations and trading errors that were covered up. The Harvard Alumni Association must be notified of the fraudulent admission. These notifications will happen regardless of her decision about the conditions. The truth, as I said, sets us free. Katherine's scream was unlike anything I'd ever heard from a human being. It started low in her throat and built to a pitch that made everyone in the room physically recoil. She swept her arms across the table, sending papers flying in every direction. Her phone crashed against the wall, the screen shattering into spiderweb cracks. She dropped to her knees, designer suit and all her body shaking with rage and disbelief. This is fake. This has to be fake. Mum would never do this to me. She was grabbing at the scattered papers, trying to find something that would prove this was all a mistake. She loved me. She said I was special. She said I was going to change the world. Wellington quietly produced a folder of supporting documents. Bank statements showing the bribes, copies of the forged Harvard application materials, with Katherine's own handwriting in the margins. Police photos from the hit-and-run scene with Mum's notes about how to make it disappear. Text messages between Katherine and Mom discussing the cover-ups, Katherine's casual tone about destroying a young man's life. Thanks for handling the situation, one message read, followed by emoji hearts. Katherine tried to lunge for the documents, but Wellington pulled them back. These are copies for the authorities, Ms. Harrison. The originals are in a safety deposit box. The family's reactions ranged from shock to disgust. Aunt Margaret, who'd always resented Mum's success, looked almost satisfied to learn it was built on corruption. I knew Dorothy was too good to be true, she muttered, clutching her jewelry inheritance like it might be contaminated. Uncle Richard stood up and walked to the window, unable to look at anyone. That poor boy, he kept saying about Daniel Morrison. The cousins were frantically texting, probably sharing the news with everyone they knew, despite Wellington's warnings about confidentiality. Within hours, this would be all over Philadelphia society. Katherine's carefully constructed world would crumble completely. Katherine turned on me, then her face twisted with fury. You knew you had to know. This is your revenge for being second best your whole life. She stood up and moved toward me, stumbling in her designer heels. You turned her against me while she was dying. You poisoned her mind when she was weak. I remained frozen in my chair, unable to speak or move. The sister I'd envied my entire life was revealing herself as someone I'd never truly known. All those achievements I'd felt inferior to were lies. All those times Mum made me feel small, she was protecting secrets that would have destroyed everything. You were always jealous, Katherine continued, her voice getting louder and more unhinged. You with your pathetic little life, your construction worker husband, your public school brats, you couldn't stand that I was everything you weren't. She actually tried to grab me, her manicured nails reaching for my throat before Uncle Richard stepped in and physically blocked her. That's enough, Katherine, he said firmly, his mechanic's hands easily holding her back. You need to leave. Wellington cleared his throat and continued reading. Francine never knew any of this. I kept it from her to protect both my daughters in different ways. Katherine? If you're attacking your sister right now, that proves you haven't learned anything. Francine, if you're in shock, that proves what I always knew but couldn't acknowledge. You're the daughter with genuine integrity. Katherine laughed bitterly, a sound that was almost worse than her scream. Integrity, is that what we're calling mediocrity now? There's more, Wellington said quietly. Mrs. Harrison anticipated this reaction. He continued reading. Katherine, your anger proves you still don't understand. It was never about intelligence or capability. You're brilliant. But brilliance without ethics is just sophisticated destruction. Every success you achieve through fraud is a success someone else was denied honestly. Daniel Morrison was studying to be a doctor. Now he'll never perform surgery. How many lives would he have saved? Katherine stopped struggling against Uncle Richard. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once. She stood there in her ruined designer suit makeup, streaked down her face, looking like a stranger wearing my sister's skin. Francine. The letter went on, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every recital I missed, every achievement I dismissed, every time I made you feel less than. You were never less than. You were the daughter who grew straight despite my crooked parenting. The money is just money, but the truth is my real gift to both of you. Katherine needs to face who she's become. You need to know who you've always been. Katherine walked unsteadily to gather her things. Her phone was destroyed, her papers scattered. She picked up her purse with shaking hands and headed for the door. At the threshold, she turned back one more time. I hope you're happy now, Francine. You finally won. Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Wellington waited until we heard the elevator close before speaking again. Ms. Bennett, there's a 30-day period for Ms. Harrison to accept or reject the conditions. If she refuses, you'll receive the full $20 million, including her $15 million inheritance, and the $500,000 already designated for you. I'll need your contact information to keep you updated on her decision. I nodded numbly, still trying to process everything that had just happened. The room felt different now, smaller somehow, like the walls had absorbed all the secrets that had been revealed. The cousins left quickly, probably eager to spread the gossip. Aunt Margaret muttered something about needing to have the jewelry appraised as if it might be fake too. Uncle Richard patted my shoulder gently before leaving the only one who seemed to understand that this wasn't a victory for anyone. I sat alone in that conference room for another hour after everyone left. Wellington's secretary brought me water and tissues, keeping a respectful distance, while I tried to make sense of everything. The scattered papers on the floor told a story I was still struggling to believe. My entire life had been shaped by lies I didn't even know existed. When I finally called Tom, I could barely get the words out. I told him about the money first, the $500,000. That was definitely ours. Then tried to explain the rest. He listened without interrupting his breathing, the only sound that let me know he was still there. When I finished, he simply said what he always said when things got complicated. Come home, honey. We'll figure it out together. The drive home felt surreal. The same streets looked different somehow, as if the truth had changed the geography of my world. I passed the elementary school where I taught the grocery store, where I shopped with coupons, the park where I took the kids on weekends. These ordinary places that Katherine had mocked were real in a way her Manhattan life had never been. Tom was waiting on the front porch when I pulled up the kids visible through the window, doing homework at the kitchen table. He wrapped me in his arms before I could speak, his flannel shirt smelling like sawdust and coffee. I'm proud of you, he whispered, though I hadn't done anything except exist honestly. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of media attention and family upheaval. Someone, probably one of the cousins, had leaked the story to the press. Pharmaceutical heiress's will reveals decades of fraud, read one headline. Harvard admission scandal extends to alumni, read another. Katherine's investment firm launched an immediate investigation. Within days, they'd found discrepancies that Mum's money had hidden. She was fired, her licenses revoked, her reputation destroyed. The Morrison family went public with their story. Daniel Morrison, now 26, gave an interview from his wheelchair about the night that changed his life. He'd been walking home from his part-time job, saving money for medical school, when a white Tesla came out of nowhere. He remembered lying on the cold pavement, unable to move, watching the car disappear into the darkness. He'd always wondered why the police investigation went nowhere, why traffic cameras mysteriously malfunctioned that night. Harvard revoked Katherine's degree after their own investigation confirmed the fraudulent admission. 20 years of alumni donations, networking, and prestige vanished with a single letter. Her apartment building in Manhattan began eviction proceedings when she couldn't make the rent without her job. The designer clothes, the jewelry, the Tesla everything was being liquidated to pay for lawyers who were trying to keep her out of prison. On day 29 of the 30-day deadline, my doorbell rang at 6 a.m. Katherine stood on my porch, but I barely recognized her. No makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked like they came from Target. The transformation was so complete that for a moment I thought someone else had come to the door. "Can I come in?" She asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Tom had already taken the kids to his mother's house, somehow knowing this conversation needed to happen privately. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one she'd once called quaint and shabby. I made coffee in my old percolator, the one she'd tried to replace with an expensive espresso machine I'd returned. She held the mug with both hands like she was cold, though the morning was warm. "I'm not going to accept the conditions," she said quietly. "Take the money, all of it. You earned it just by being real." She looked around my kitchen with something that might have been envy. "You know what's funny? I used to pity you for this life. The small house, the teacher salary, the ordinary everything. But you actually built this. It's actually yours." For the first time in our lives, we had a real conversation. She told me about the pressure she'd felt to be perfect, how Mom's expectations became a prison she couldn't escape. Every achievement required a bigger one to follow. Every lie required more lies to support it. She'd known the Harvard admission was fake, but convinced herself she would have gotten in anyway if the system was fair. The trading errors were just bad luck that anyone could have. The hit and run was the only one she couldn't rationalize away. I see him sometimes, she admitted, staring into her coffee. Daniel Morrison. Not literally, but in my mind. I wonder what kind of doctor he would have been. Mom made it disappear so fast it felt like it never happened. But it did happen. I did that. Me, not Mom, not money, me. She told me she'd started therapy on her own, without the court mandate paying for it by selling her designer bags. She was working at a grocery store, stocking shelves at night, living in a studio apartment in a part of Philadelphia she would have been afraid to drive through before. It's honest work, she said with a bitter smile. Boxes are just boxes. They don't care about your Harvard degree. Do you hate me? I asked the question that had haunted me since the will reading. Katherine thought for a long moment. I hate who I was. I hate what Mom and I did together. But hate you, no. You were just living your life while we were constructing our elaborate lies. If anything, I hate that you were right there the whole time showing us how to live authentically, and we were too arrogant to see it. Before she left, she asked for one favor. Don't give me any of the money. Not now, not later. I need to know that whatever I rebuild is real. The first honest thing I've done in 20 years is refusing that money. Let me keep that at least. I watched her drive away in a 10-year-old Honda Civic, almost identical to mine. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of us. 6 months have passed since that morning in the lawyer's office. The $15 million transferred to my accounts, plus the $500,000 Mom originally left me. The number still doesn't feel real when I check the balance. Tom and I paid off the mortgage immediately, that weight lifting from our shoulders, with a simple electronic transfer. We set up college funds for Emma and Jake, enough to let them pursue any dream without the burden of loans. We also sent $2 million to Daniel Morrison, not as blood money or guilt payment, but as recognition of what was stolen from him. He sent back a handwritten note saying he was using it to fund a scholarship for other students pursuing medical careers. He couldn't become a doctor, but he could help others achieve what was taken from him. His grace in the face of such loss humbled me more than any words could express. I'm still teaching 5th grade at the same elementary school. My colleagues assumed I'd quit immediately, but walking away from those kids felt like betraying who I was. I did buy new supplies for my classroom, updated the reading corner with hundreds of new books, and secretly paid off lunch debt for every family in the school. The principal cried when an anonymous donation covered field trips for the entire year. Tom still runs his construction company, though he did finally buy a new truck. The old one sits in our garage, a reminder of harder times we survived together. He hired 3 more workers guys who needed second chances and takes on projects for Habitat for Humanity on weekends. We moved to a slightly bigger house, nothing fancy, just enough room for the kids to each have their own bedroom and a proper home office for me. Katherine sent me one text message 3 months after our last conversation. I'm learning who I really am. I drove by the grocery store where she works, once saw her through the window, stocking shelves with focused determination. She looked tired but present in a way she'd never been in her Manhattan life. I didn't go in, didn't want to disturb whatever piece she was building from the ground up. Aunt Margaret tried to return the jewelry after learning about Mum's crimes, afraid it was somehow tainted. I told her to keep it. Those pieces weren't bought with bribes. They were family heirlooms that deserved to stay in the family. Uncle Richard used the main house to start a program for disabled veterans, teaching them to fish and find peace by the water. He named it after Dad, not Mum. Our last family gathering was Thanksgiving, smaller and quieter than previous years. Katherine's absence was palpable, an empty chair that held more presence than she ever had when she was there. We told stories about Mum, but they were different now, more honest, acknowledging the complicated woman she'd been, rather than the titan she'd pretended to be. Emma asked me why Aunt Katherine didn't come anymore. I told her sometimes people need to go away to find themselves. Jake wanted to know if she was lost. In a way, I said, but sometimes being lost is the only way to find the right path. They accepted this with the simple wisdom children possess, then went back to their mashed potatoes. I've thought a lot about what Mum meant by saying she made sure everyone got what they deserved. On the surface, it seems like punishment for Katherine and reward for me, but I think it was more complex than that. Katherine needed to lose everything built on lies to find anything real. I needed to know my worth wasn't lesser just because it wasn't flashy. We both needed the truth, even though it came wrapped in pain. The money sits mostly untouched in conservative investments. We live essentially the same life, just without the constant financial anxiety. The real inheritance wasn't the millions. It was the freedom to be ourselves without shame or comparison. Katherine is free from the prison of false success. I'm free from the shadow of false failure. Sometimes I dream about that conference room, about the moment when $15 million became worthless in the face of truth. In the dreams, Mum is there watching from the corner, neither smiling nor frowning, just observing what her final honesty wrought. I want to ask her why she waited until death to tell the truth, but even in dreams, she doesn't answer. The lesson I've taken from all of this is simpler than you might expect. Success built on lies will always crumble no matter how much money shores it up. A modest truth is worth more than a magnificent lie. Family favoritism doesn't create winners and losers. It creates different kinds of victims. And sometimes, just sometimes, a scream of anguish marks the beginning of redemption, not just the end of deception. Mum gave Katherine $15 million that destroyed her carefully constructed false life. She gave me truth that validated my authentic one. In that lawyer's office, we both got exactly what we needed, if not what we wanted. The only difference was that I didn't know I needed it while Katherine had been running from it her entire life. What would you do if you discovered your entire family history was built on lies? Would you take the money that came from such dark revelations? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family dramas. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their authentic life has more value than any false success. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, but truth that sets us free.